Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello, and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of September 14th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, I'm happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Eric McDaniel, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Government here at UT Austin. He's the author of Politics in the Pews, The Political Mobilization of Black Churches, and among other affiliations is currently serving as a Public Religion Research Institute Public Fellow. We'll inevitably mention PRRI, and that's what we're talking about. So thanks for being here, Eric.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's just jump right to it. You've got a couple of pieces out there in the public ether that have come out in the last couple of weeks based on research that you've been doing on what you've called, I may be changing your language here a little bit, the concept of threatened white masculinity. One of these pieces is in Salon, the other is on the Texas Politics Project on the blog in our polling section, and I'll put links to this in the blog post for this edition of the podcast. So, I want to start with kind of the broad view of your interest here. You started doing work back in the much earlier part of your career on politics and religion, particularly in Black churches. We mentioned your book. I'm wondering how you developed this idea and developed the interest in this idea of white masculinity and its implications for politics.
Yeah, Jim, that's a really interesting question of how I got here. I think a lot of it was some observational things that I noticed. So the kind of good guys with guns, or the differential treatment you saw of kind of blacks with guns and whites with guns, where one is seen as protector, the other one is seen as predator. And really looking at the rhetoric of the 2016 election made it very almost hard to ignore. But what I'm talking about with showing with these data is something that's been talked about for quite a bit now. Since the 90s, or even really since the 60s, there has been this discussion of a kind of a threat to white masculinity. So there were a lot of conservative pundits in the 50s and 60s talking about with women working, that men were losing their place in the household, but also with the advancement of the civil rights movement, where were white men going to be in regard to this? And then you see kind of coming out of the 80s and 90s, a lot of stories about the fall of white masculinity and how white men feel like they're being left behind. And this became, a clear aspect of it when talking about the 2016 election. And the presence of a black president and then the potential for a female president basically made it look like white men were no longer relevant. And there was this concern, and it's something that, President Trump tapped into, and his rhetoric was he really stressed masculinity. We're calling people little Marco, how big his hands were. It was something that was clearly to show that he was the big man in the room. And this kind of stuck out to me. And so I started looking at the data, originally started with data from PRRI, and they had two questions. And so one was, society's become too soft and feminine. The other question was that diversity comes at the expense of whites. So I started there, and
that was kind of like an agree. That was like an agree disagree, right?
It's like the extent to which you agree or disagree,
right?
And really, gender mattered quite a bit. There's a article by Melissa Deckman which demonstrates that this gender thing really mattered. But I've also found that the race thing mattered as well. Maybe not as much as gender in that case, but all of a sudden race and gender became interlocked. And you find that people who agree with both of these had of those who agree with both statements, about 90% of them reported voting for Trump. And so this is for men and women. And you can see that Democrats who agree with both, independents, more likely to vote for Trunk. Once you get to Republicans, you kind of hit a bit of a ceiling effect because you can't push them even further towards Trump. But the evidence suggests that that was also a motivating factor.
I mean, it was one of the real things that I found really interesting is, we talked about this and I started reading the stuff that you were doing. And, this really came out of a look at the historical development in the context of this. It's not this thing that seems to me really appeared to you in the kind of quantitative, more behavioral work that people do, but rather it connects to a broad arc. And you've traced it back to the 60s and the kind of, broadly speaking, a modern manifestation of this that comes in the post-civil rights movement. My guess is, and you could tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, you could, if one was so inclined, you could trace this pretty far back as you think about, the discourses, going back as far as discourses about slavery, discourses then about freed slaves, and then also discourses even about immigration to some degree, although there's an interesting asterisk on this, that, there's something really powerful that you're kind of developing there because you can see it really threaded through a long historical arc. And, I'm not saying you invented this concept, but in the way that you've seized on it, there's a lot going on there that goes back pretty far, right?
Yes, and it's really a way of thinking about how Americans have come to define themselves. So Christian Dumais has a book titled Jesus and John Wayne, which talks about really evangelicals and how they've latched onto this idea that there's a threat to white Christian masculinity. And this idea, when she talks about the John Wayne issue, it's something that happened early in the 20th century and something that's kind of been reoccurring throughout American history of the placement of white men. And if you think about the early stages of the nation, the people who could vote were white men, usually white middle-class men. And so you have this idea that this is the ideal type. So a white land-owning Christian male is the ideal type American. And this has continued to exist. When you ask surveys now, should you be a Christian to be an American? You find that, close to the majority of Americans agree with this. Should you be white? Should you have European ancestry? You get this clear image of a white Christian nation. And the gendered part isn't really highlighted. But I do think there is something about this that it's not just an issue of race, but race and gender, and it's kind of establishing a hierarchy within the U.S. And while the U.S. prides itself on focusing on egalitarian principles, it cannot necessarily move away from these classic descriptive ways of understanding who is and who isn't American. And because classically, when we think of president, white male. When we think of leaders, white men. And when we're seeing a female Speaker of the House, you're seeing openly seeing people of color take on leadership roles. You're seeing individuals who are part of the LGBTQ community taking on roles. All of a sudden, this begins to reshape where they fall within this. And this is kind of a critical thing. This is important to their identity, understanding who they are, their role in the world, and this has been lost because they politically they are not the beacon. Economically, they're losing out, and so there is this a bit of an angst. And what should be done? And a lot of what you're seeing done with the rise of the Tea Party and other groups is really a reaction to this sense of a threat to their identity and a threat to their standing in society.
I'm interested that you mentioned losing out in that because it also, one of the things that I think is a little bit embedded in this, and we can talk a little bit about it in the data as we move on, is that this undermines a little bit, the debate that's out there, certainly was out there after Trump's rise and after Donald Trump won the 2016 election about kind of, culture and identity on one hand, and also in the Tea Party movement, culture and identity on one hand and economics on the other, because really status and relative position and, as you mentioned, hierarchy really is kind of a composite of all those things. And so it becomes about kind of teasing all that out rather than arguing one or the other, I think. That makes sense?
Oh, very much so. And I guess the way I think about it is that race is baked into the cake. Race isn't everything in American politics, but it does have an effect on a lot of things. And so, same thing with gender. So one of the things that's important to note about the rise of the Tea Party, and I think a great book to look into is Matt Barretto and Chris Parker's book, Change They Can't Believe In, which talks about the rise of the Tea Party. And they point out that this was not really an issue of being anti-tax or the economy. It was really more of a reaction to a loss of status amongst white, middle-class, Christian men. So in addition to this, one of the things we've seen, or a lot of scholars have done, is they've noted that the way white men define themselves is based upon what white masculinity is in many ways shaped in contrast to white femininity and black masculinity. And when we think about economic standing, that a lot of times economic standing is based upon how well is the other group doing. If I'm doing better than the other group, then I'm okay. But if I feel like I'm not doing as well as the other group, then I'm gonna panic. And so it's one of these things that it's very complicated. And there are a bunch of books which have talked about this. So one in particular, Angry White Men, where basically a bunch of case studies with white men talk about what happened. And again, they talk about the loss of status. And when they direct their anger towards a group, they direct it towards immigrants, towards feminists, towards people of color. And this is something that President Trump has tapped into. We're talking about the threat of immigrants, the very strong macho talk, and even right now, the idea of keeping low-income individuals out of the suburbs is basically saying we're going to keep the rowdy people of color away from these communities. And it's really tapped into this. And the problem is, because it's so reactionary, that things aren't well thought out. It's done based out of anger and out of reaction, as opposed to clearly being thought out, which can lead to disastrous conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you track that kind of trajectory of the Tea Party. Josh and I have done a couple of, really just papers for the sake of an excuse or a reason to go and gather up data that you can really clearly see in Texas the way that people who identify with the Tea Party or at least have a degree of passive support for the Tea Party in one of the items that we used in the poll across time, begin, you can find signs that in the beginning they're catalyzed by this argument about the economy, but also about big government, but that over time you can really just see, the displacement of that discontent onto issues like immigration. And then later on, I think we haven't really gone back and looked at this, but I think later on you can see race become entangled in that even more than it is explicitly in the immigration notion of the way that immigration triggers identity. And it kind of displaces all that and becomes a powerful common point in the way that they think about politics. With that, so let's so we've raised Texas in a couple of ways here. Let's talk a little bit about what you did with the Texas data. So, first talk a little bit about how you operationalized the concept of threats to white masculinity in the data that you used from the Texas polling.
So with the Texas poll, I created an additive measure into a composite of how much do you believe certain groups are discriminated against. And so the Texas poll asked a battery of questions about how much discrimination is targeted towards certain groups. So you had men, women, gays and lesbians, transgender people, Christians, Muslims, blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians. So what I did is I took the respondents' average score for blacks, Asians, and Latinos. So I kind of added those three and divided by 3 to get the average, and subtracted that from the score for whites. Then for men, I took the average for women, gay people, transgender people, and took that average and subtracted it from women, and then added the two together. And so the way this works out is that if you believe whites and men are discriminated more so than these comparison groups, you're going to be at the high end. If you believe they're discriminated less, you're going to be at the low end. If you're in the middle, it means you think they're discriminated about the same amount. And so what we have here is a measure that basically puts people at two polar ends of one, white men are being targeted. 2, white men are not being targeted at all. And then those in the middle, like, no, they're facing the same amount of discrimination as anybody else. And that's the purpose of the measure. And the thing about this, what I find is that it works very well. It seems to really indicate a deep-seated attitude that is strongly correlated with a number of policy preferences and attitudes towards elected officials.
Yeah, as you started running the state, it was amazing how well it fit. So tell us a little bit about, like, unpack that a little bit. And we don't have to go into the specific, but in terms of the relative perception of, the intensity of the perception of threat among these different groups. Like, for example, it was really held up pretty in interesting ways at the intersection of, within the categories of race and gender, and then at the intersection of race and gender, right?
Yes. So clearly, if you think about this, is white men scored the highest, but right below white men, you found kind of Hispanic men and white women. They were up there as well.
They were the top three in the perception of threat, right? Yeah. Yeah,
the top 3, and then followed by Latino women, then black men and black women. We couldn't include other groups because there was just too small of a sample of those groups. But if you think about it in terms of, it's white men at the top, and then you kind of have a tie for second place between Hispanic men and white women, and then Hispanic women, black men, and black women. So black women are clearly most opposed to this idea. And the thing about it is there is a bit of a gap between black men and black women, but it's a very minor gap. And the gap between Hispanic men and women is small as well. And so really the top 3 are going to be where white men are clearly above everybody else. Then, white women and Hispanic men are kind of tied in that regard.
So there's been an interesting discussion, like right now in the moment, and I was going to kind of have us go through some of this and do implications, but let's just grab it now while we're on top of it. I mean, that finding on Hispanic men, it's hard not to look at that and think about the politics of the moment and this ongoing discussion about, whether, for example, Republicans, but more specifically Trump, is doing better than he should or worse than he should, or whether it's interesting that, that he is doing, that he is getting some share of the Hispanic vote, despite, lots of reasons you might think that he wouldn't.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting point. And we've looked at the
one wants to walk
and,
softly on this. I mean, it's pretty preliminary, but still.
Yeah, it's really not clear why they're scoring so high. I mean, they score about the same, both on the kind of the white threat and the male threat. So it's not sure if one is driving the other, and it's not clear at all. There seems to be some issues related to religious conservatism that might be driving this, but that's not really clear. And I think one of the major issues we have when looking at the Latino population is that, unlike the black population, which is there's a clearly formed racial identity, it's not as strong amongst Latinos, I believe. Again, it's more of an ethnicity. And so whereas black is something, a race is seen as something permanent, something you're born into and you can't leave, ethnicity is seen as something that can be shed over time. So you can learn a new language, you can adopt a new culture, and you can be part of this. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but I do think that you do have a significant number of individuals in the Latino population who may see themselves, who may say that, yeah, I'm Hispanic, but be more likely to understand themselves as being white than being Hispanic. So yeah, I'm Hispanic, but I'm a white Hispanic. That might be driving it, or it could be a number of other things that are driving this. So I'm not really sure, and this is going to take a deeper dive, and really we probably need a much larger sample in order to parse this out. But Latino politics is a lot more complicated than you see in black politics because of the immigration status, national origin, and then also the Latino experience changes from region to region. Latinos in Texas have a different experience than Latinos in California. than the ones in Florida, than the ones in New York. And this kind of makes things, it's hard to say that, oh, this is one group.
Right.
When really, in reality, it's a bunch of different groups. And they have vastly different experiences, and these experiences play out differently politically.
Well, and we're seeing this, it's a long, this has been going on for quite a while, but it's making manifest again right now because of the election and the role of Latinos in the election. That, it's always struck me that there is a reflex, particularly in media coverage and among people that don't pay only sporadic attention to this, to do two things. One is to not, quite realize that, this regional and country of origin and immigration trajectory, all of a bunch of factors lead to a lot of differentiation within the Latino community. I mean, we're seeing it right now in the discussion of, why Biden is not doing well, or ostensibly not doing well among Latinos in Florida, but seems to be doing well among Latinos elsewhere. And I've had, a couple of people, get in touch, reporters recently, kind of saying, hey, what do you think of this? And the answer is fairly obvious, that the ethnic composition of Latinos in Florida is vastly different than the ethnic composition of Latinos in Texas and in California, just to take two examples. But also you could add New York to that, given the heavy presence of Cuban Americans and Latinos of otherwise Cuban origin in Florida, which has always looked somewhat different than some of these other Latino groups, who in turn look different from each other. And this sort of line of argument or this result in the work you've done recently also raises these big questions, I think. The study of these groups has often been politicized in interesting ways. I mean, because, to me, the specter of, the very pointed disagreements within people that were doing Mexican American and Latino studies in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, argued over the concept of assimilation, is really lurking here, as are the very practical political, fights in Texas over, how civil rights legislation and civil rights court rulings in various ways that created, legal categories of black and white, and the strategy that Latino political activists took in whether they were going to try to have Latinos and Mexican Americans qualify as a minority group or as something more like white. And that's, and that has caused practical political friction between black and Latino groups over the years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take on this, because given the Latino experience in Texas, they've clearly been a marked group, and they've classically been treated or talked about as immigrants. But, as a lot of us say, is we didn't cross the border crossed us. And so they've been here for generations, but still seen as outsiders.
Yeah, subject to segregationist policies,
yes,
unambiguously, right?
Oh, yeah. And, things such as, the thing about the high schools. I was listening to a friend of mine's mother talk about how the segregated high schools for white kids would go all the way up to graduation, but for Latino kids, it would stop at 10th grade. And this is in the Austin area. And so if you wanted the kid to graduate, you had to send them down to the valley. And so you'd have to send them away from family to then graduate from high school to then get those benefits. California had to wrestle with this as well. There's this film I show in my class called the Lemon Grove Incident, and this has happened, I want to say, in the 40s and 50s, where they tried to segregate the school between Latinos and whites, and the courts ruled that because Latinos are considered Caucasian in the state of California, they can't be segregated. If they were Negro, if they were Indian, they could be segregated. But because since they were considered Caucasian, they cannot be. And that's how they won the case. They didn't win the case because the court ruled segregation is wrong. They ruled you can't segregate within race.
They were segregated into the wrong category.
Yeah. And so this presents a weird way of understanding. Okay, what is how do we understand race and ethnicity? How do we understand this group, which is an ethnic group, and the idea that ethnicity is malleable? And who's accepted, who's not accepted, and a lot of it is really based upon outside pressures. And if we understand how racial groups form, they're not formed internally. They're usually formed externally. The external pressures make it so that you understand that no, we are a group, and these other people see us as a group, and they're going to keep us as a group.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a function of how fundamental those categories are, that when you try to talk about racialization, quote unquote, as a social process, people have a lot of trouble with it. And it's at an intuitive level, which I've always thought is, underlines how well it works as a social process, right? Or how effective and powerful it is.
Yeah, for the longest time, Irish and Italians were not considered white. They were considered to be outside of the white race, but eventually they were brought into the fold. And it shows just how malleable race is. And again, the way we understand race in the U.S. is different than how it might be understood in Latin America. So, right. Yeah. So it's a fairly fluid concept where you are in space and time depicts how you understand race.
Okay, I want to move on before we run out of time too much and talk a little bit more. But let's, you found this, and I would urge people to go and look at the article that Eric produced for our website, because all of this and more is in there. There's you look at sort of how this plays out in the context of party and attitudes towards Trump, attitudinal, questions that were on, and this was all from the June 2020 UT Texas Politics Project poll in Texas. Attitudes about increasing diversity on police violence. But I also want to talk a little bit, because it's so of the moment, about what you found in the context of COVID-19. Because in some ways this, as interesting as this is, as you go through party, Trump, attitudes on race and gender, attitudes towards diversity, once you kind of get in your head what you're talking about and what the concept of the ideological concept is here, it all kinds of falls into place, and these attitudes are stronger to some degree where you would expect them to be stronger. The COVID-19 stuff was an interesting extension of that maybe not quite as intuitive on the surface of it. So maybe talk a little bit about what you found there.
So again, as you pointed out, looking at just normal political attitudes, strong support for Trump, strong identification with the Republican Party, a concern about the amount of diversity within the state as opposed to celebrating it, and then, of course, opposition to the protests. And when you move this to COVID-19, what you find is that people who score high on this white masculinity threat measure are the ones who are most likely to downplay it. So whereas you find close to more than half of those of Texans see it as a significant crisis, you find that only about 1 in 5 in the high category see it as a significant crisis. So they're really kind of downplaying. And I mean, you get about half of those in the high category saying it's a serious problem, but not a crisis. But if you move to things such as how concerned they are, they're less concerned about the spread of it in the community. They're less concerned about them getting it or somebody else getting it. And this translates into, just the belief that, we can go back to normal either immediately or very soon, and more focus on helping the economy as opposed to controlling the spread of the virus. Then if you look at just various activities, they're just less likely to engage in these preventative activities. And, as far as staying at home behavior, very few people are staying at home. But we find that the data shows that 40% of those who strongly believe that there is a threat against white masculinity are basically said, I'm living normal. Where we find that in general, 1 in 5 Texans says they're living normal. So this group is abnormal. That if you compare them to the overall average of Texans, that the reason why some of these scores may be so high, or the number of people doing some of these things that may be seen as contradictory to preventing the disease is so high, is because of those in this high category. They're the ones who are kind of gung-ho about, everything's fine, let's go back to normal. Whereas those in the low category are like, no, we need to listen to the doctors, we need to stay away from everything else that's going on. And also they're less likely to participate in a variety of, less likely to get vaccinated, less likely to participate in tracking. And this is the group that is just strongly opposed to seeing this as a serious threat and following through with government recommendations and public health recommendations on how to stop the spread of the virus. And the idea of masculinity is important here because you're seeing things coming out like Vice President Pence. You had the couple other reports where people talked about wearing a mask is not masculine. It emasculates men. Like they put this in male context, in the context of masculinity, and frame this. And most of this is coming out of white politicians who argue that masks are harmful to men's psychology.
Well, you went where I was going to urge you to go. I was going to ask you to spin that out a little bit and, just sort of, and speculate for me. And you did that. And I thought it was a fascinating result in, that, it added dimensionality to, some other work that's been done with the data in that poll that Megan Moeller did, and also out of the government department at one point. Looking really just at gender on that dimension, and it really fleshes that out and adds a bunch more structure, to this idea that's just based on gender. When you add, this notion of a certain conception of gender identity, it's kind of, it hones it down a little bit. What should we have talked about that we didn't as we go down to the last couple minutes? What really, or let me put it this way, what's next? So you've looked at this, you've kind of thought through, you've looked at these kind of results that you've gotten. Where do you go next with this?
So the results that I'm presenting are the kind of crosstabs. This is the descriptive data. And I've done some multivariate analysis where I'm able to account for things such as religion, age, sex, gender, partisanship, and then seeing, is this really just a proxy for something else? And the results have shown that it's not. And that, even when I account for partisanship, that, this attitude, this belief is still there. And in some cases, either as important or more important than partisanship. So the next step is saying, okay, how does this play out? A better understanding of who adheres to this belief and what are their politics, not just with COVID-19, but in other areas. How might this be shaping really their ways of interacting with the government, what they expect out of leaders, and what they want their nation to look like? And I think this is critical because we're at a very critical juncture in American history right now. And this is a group that is fighting for a particular image of the nation. And we need to understand what is the image that they want and what are they willing to do to achieve that image.
I think that is a great summation of where you've been and where you're going and what we should look for. Eric, thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much, Jim.
All right, man. We'll do it again soon, I hope. That's it for the Second Reading podcast for this week. You will find this on the Texas Politics Project website. And when we post this on the blog site, we'll add links to the things that Eric has written and some of the things that we've talked about. You can also find this podcast from week to week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. I want to thank Eric again for being here and thank our crew, as always, in Liberal Arts ITS and the Liberal Arts Development Studio. And thank our listeners. You'll find this and other things at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we'll be back next week. Thanks. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.